Everybody knows gasoline can explode. Propane too. Natural gas. Acetylene. There is a category in your head for things that blow up, and sugar is not in it. That's part of what makes the Imperial Sugar disaster so hard to sit with. On February 7, 2008, inside a refinery in Port Wentworth, Georgia, an ordinary food ingredient turned the air itself into fuel. The first explosion likely began in an enclosed steel conveyor running beneath two giant storage silos. It lasted seconds. What it set in motion lasted minutes, and those minutes killed 14 people. But I want to be clear about something from the beginning. This is not a story about a mysterious substance behaving in ways nobody anticipated. The danger was documented. It was acknowledged, internally, in writing, decades before that night. What failed at Imperial Sugar was not knowledge. It was every institutional layer that was supposed to do something with that knowledge. Let me start with the science, because it matters, but I am not going to spend long on it. Sugar in a bag is not dangerous. Sugar as fine airborne particulate, suspended in sufficient concentration in a confined space with an ignition source, is a different physical situation entirely. Industrial dust explosion literature going back to 1925 identified sugar as, and this is a direct quote, exceptionally dangerous among common dusts. Not moderately, exceptionally. Imperial's own product documentation listed the explosive concentration threshold and the ignition temperature. The company's own materials contain the warning. Port Wentworth was one of the largest sugar refineries in the country. More than 350 employees and contractors worked there. The facility was producing more than 700,000 tons annually. This was not a small, obscure operation running a marginal process nobody had thought carefully about. It was a major industrial site that had been running for a long time. And that last part is where the problem actually starts. One of the things that happens to a major industrial site that runs for a long time without a catastrophe is that the conditions inside it start to get normalized. The dust on the elevated surfaces, the sugar spilled at floor level, the small fires that get put out before anyone calls them anything. You work around those things long enough, they stop registering as warnings. They become the baseline. I have covered this failure mode before in the video I did on the BP Texas City explosion, where the ISOM unit had exhibited abnormal startup behavior in 15 of its last 19 executions, and nobody read that pattern as a problem, because each completed startup became implicit evidence that the process was sound. The mechanism at Imperial Sugar is structurally identical. A hazardous condition repeats. Nothing catastrophic results. The repetition itself starts to function as reassurance. The threshold for concern rises with every completed near miss, right up until the near miss that does not complete. The records at Port Wentworth go back a long way on this. There was a dust explosion in the mill room in 1968. There was a sugar dust explosion at Imperial's refinery in Sugar Land, Texas in 1998 that one severely burned an employee. Workers reported recurring small fires, recurring dust accumulations, recurring conditions that any honest reading of the hazard literature would classify as precursors. Less than 2 weeks before February 7th, a small explosion in a dry dust collector on the roof damaged the equipment. It did not trigger a systematic review of anything. And then there is the document I cannot stop thinking about. In 1967, 41 years before the explosion, someone inside that refinery wrote an internal memo warning that heavy dust accumulations were fuel for an explosion that could travel from one area to another and wreck large sections of the plant. That is not ambiguous language. That is not a hedged document that could be read multiple ways. That is a precise description of the disaster that happened in 2008, written 4 decades before it happened by someone who worked there. When I find something like that in a case file, it changes how I read everything that comes after. Because at that point, the question is no longer whether the hazard was understood. It was. The question is what the organization did with the understanding for the next 4 decades. Now, I want to talk about the audit situation because it is one of the darker subplots in this story, and I think it gets underreported. In May 2007, AIB International audited the Port Wentworth facility and gave it a superior rating. Superior, the highest category available, 9 months before 14 people died inside it. The catch, and it is a meaningful catch, is that AIB's audit was a food safety audit. It was evaluating whether sugar was contaminated, not whether the dust it produced could kill workers. Those are different questions. They require different inspections and different expertise. The superior rating was accurate in the narrow sense that it reflected what the audit actually measured. From the perspective of anyone trying to understand the combustible dust risk inside that building, it was functionally useless as a safety document. Zurich's risk review, conducted in the same spring, also failed to adequately address combustible dust hazards. 2 external reviews, same year, same facility, same blind spot in both of them. This is not a story about incompetent auditors. It is a story about what happens when the scope of an audit gets treated as equivalent to the scope of safety. A food quality audit will produce accurate findings about food quality. It will produce no findings about explosive dust accumulation, because that is not what the questions are designed to catch. If management then files that audit as evidence that the plant is safe, the problem is not the auditors. The problem is the assumption that a superior rating on contamination control tells you anything at all about whether the facility is configured to kill people. That assumption was not examined. The file said superior, and superior went into the record. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, had launched its Combustible Dust National Emphasis Program in October 2007. Imperial's own safety personnel knew about it by early December. The safety focus of the month communication that went out on January 30th, 2008, 8 days before the explosion, did not mention combustible dust. I do not know how to make that detail more legible than just saying it plainly. They were aware the program existed. They sent a safety communication. They did not connect the two. Now I want to explain the conveyor enclosure because it is the engineering decision that turns this from a neglected hazard that finally caught up with everyone into something more specific and more troubling. In 2007, the same year as the audits, Imperial enclosed the steel belt conveyors running beneath the silos and in the penthouse. The reason was product protection. Open conveyors can pick up debris and contamination. Enclosing them keeps the sugar clean. This is a legitimate engineering objective. Under normal circumstances, it is a sensible modification. The problem is what the enclosure actually created. The new enclosed space had roughly 1/10 the volume of the original tunnel. Smaller volume means you need far less airborne dust to reach explosive concentration. The enclosure also had no dust removal system and no explosion venting. You now had a confined space with a sharply reduced ignition threshold, directly beneath 2 silos holding significant sugar inventory, with no mechanical way to remove accumulating dust and no designed path for a pressure wave to travel if something ignited. The Chemical Safety Board concluded that the primary explosion most likely began inside that enclosed conveyor, probably ignited by an overheated bearing. The enclosure did not cause the explosion in the sense that it generated the spark. It caused the explosion in the sense that it took an already dangerous environment and made it geometrically easier to reach the ignition threshold. Here is what bothers me most about this. The conveyor enclosure was a deliberate, documented modification. It went through some kind of approval process. Someone decided it was the right call. And at no point in that process did anyone apparently stop to ask whether a smaller, unventilated enclosed space directly beneath a sugar silo represented a categorically different combustible dust risk than the open conveyor it replaced. The fix for one problem quietly created a worse one, and the worse one was invisible until it wasn't. On the evening of February 7th, 2008, the primary explosion occurred at around 7:15. The first 911 call came in at 7:17. What happened between those 2 moments and in the minutes after is where the fatalities become explicable in a way that goes beyond the initial blast. The primary explosion shook loose the accumulated sugar dust from every elevated surface it could reach, including equipment, overhead conveyors, and floors. It suspended that dust in the air. The secondary explosions that followed moved through the packing buildings in fireballs that did not stay where they started. They traveled. They erupted for more than 15 minutes. Windows were blown more than 200 feet from the structure. Floors heaved, water pipes ruptured. The blast damage was not confined to the zone of initial ignition. Inside the buildings, workers had no audible or visual alarm system. There were no alarm devices in the work areas. Many workers found out what was happening through radios, cell phones, or someone physically running to tell them. Emergency lighting failed or was inadequate. Large equipment and conveyors made movement through the darkened buildings extremely difficult. The company had not conducted evacuation drills. 8 workers died at the scene. 6 more died later at a burn center. The last of them died 6 months after the explosion. 36 others survived with injuries that, for some of them, were permanent. 2 of the workers who died reportedly re-entered the building to try to get co-workers out. I want to be careful with that detail. There is a version of this story that leans on individual courage to make institutional failure feel more tolerable, to give the audience somewhere to put their feelings that is not outrage. That is not what I am doing here. I am telling you because it is part of the record, and because it says something about the kind of people who were inside those buildings, who had no part in the decisions that put them there. The CSB investigation ran 19 months. Its conclusions were not hedged. The disaster was preventable. Equipment design, maintenance, and housekeeping were all inadequate over a sustained period. The lead investigator said management had failed to take effective action over many years. Even as smaller fires and explosions continued to occur, the CSB chairman said the explosion was entirely preventable and the deaths should never have happened. That phrase is worth holding for a moment. It gets said after a lot of disasters, and it can start to feel like a formality. In this case, the record actually earns it. There was a 1967 memo. There was a 1998 explosion that burned a worker. There were recurring fires. There was a roof-level explosion 2 weeks before. There was an OSHA program that safety personnel knew about. There was an audit with the wrong scope that went into the file as a clearance. There was a conveyor enclosure installed without an honest assessment of what it was creating. At every point where the accumulating risk could have been interrupted, it was not. That is what preventable means when an investigation uses the word precisely. There is also a regulatory dimension to this that explains part of how it was possible. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, had a combustible dust standard for the grain handling industry. It did not have a comparable standard for general industry. Those are not the same thing. Grain handling is covered. A sugar refinery is not grain handling under the applicable framework, even though the physics of fine organic dust suspended in a confined space is functionally identical. The hazard does not know what industry it is in. The regulatory structure cared about the distinction in a way the dust did not. I covered the parallel dynamic in my video on the Northeast blackout, and again in more detail in what I did on Texas. The space between voluntary and mandatory standards is not a minor regulatory technicality. It is the space where known hazards remain, known hazards for decades without becoming requirements. OSHA launched its combustible dust emphasis program in October 2007, months before the explosion. 1 month after the explosion, Georgia moved to create emergency combustible dust regulations at the state level. In 2009, OSHA announced it intended to begin rulemaking on a general industry standard. The sequence of those dates tells you something. The hazard was not new. The regulatory response came after 14 people died. The settlement came in July 2010. OSHA announced Imperial Sugar would pay more than $6 million, $4,050,000 for 124 violations at Port Wentworth, and $2 million for 97 violations at the Louisiana facility. The settlement required housekeeping programs, dust mapping, maintenance protocols, and independent outside experts. The packing buildings, silos, and the palletizer room had been destroyed. The silo fires smoldered for 7 days after the explosion and were finally extinguished on February 15th. Imperial Sugar itself was acquired in 2012 and ceased to exist as an independent company. I want to close with the detail that, for me, sits at the center of this whole case, not the explosion itself, not the settlement, not the regulatory gap. It is the 1967 memo. Someone at that plant, 41 years before it exploded, sat down and wrote a warning that described the exact scenario that killed 14 workers. An explosion traveling from one area to another, destroying large sections of a plant. That document went into a file. Over the next 4 decades, the institutional memory around it either faded or was never operationally connected to anything. The housekeeping programs got treated as routine maintenance tasks. The small fires got treated as isolated incidents. The audits got treated as safety clearances, even when they were asking different questions. The conveyor enclosure got approved without anyone apparently going back to ask what the dust literature said. The memo stayed in the file. Documents do not prevent disasters. Organizations do, or they do not. What that memo represents is the beginning of a very long institutional failure. A failure to translate documented knowledge into sustained action. A failure to treat recurring warning signs as a pattern rather than a series of isolated events. And a failure to ask, when making the enclosure modification in 2007, what new problem the solution might be creating. Imperial Sugar was not destroyed by one spark. It was destroyed by years of treating an explosive warning as ordinary dust. If this story connects to anything you have seen here before, the video I did on the BP Texas City explosion covers a lot of similar structural ground: the normalized anomalies, the instrument failures, the gap between what management believed they were measuring and what the facility was actually doing. The parallels are not coincidental. This is a failure category, not a series of unrelated accidents. If you found this useful, a like helps other people find it, and subscribing means you will be here for the next one. I cover infrastructure failure, regulatory failure, and the specific decisions that connect the two. I want to ask you something directly, because I genuinely do not think this has a clean answer. When you look at a case like this, where documented warnings existed decades in advance, where external auditors visited and left satisfied, where the regulatory gap was real but known, where does accountability actually land for you? The company, the auditors, the regulator, or somewhere else? Leave a comment. I read them, and on this one I am still working out my own answer.